Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking from RWK Goodman with me, Ed Wootton.
And me, Liam Pape.
So Liam, what have we got on the podcast this time?
So, in today's episode, we mark approximately 2 years since the launch of RWK Goodman's Retail Reboot report, which you can still find on our website. So, to mark that, we reflect on the Retail Reboot report with two of our guests, who are Vicky Hernandez, who is a partner and head of retail at RWK Goodman, and Graham Soult, who is a retail consultant who supports shops and high streets UK-wide, and he is the owner and retail consultant at CannyInsights.com. In today's episode, we discuss the legal and regulatory shifts that have happened on the high street since 2021, changes to data protection and privacy regulation, and how sustainability and environmental concerns have become more prominent in recent years as well, amongst much more actually. This is a really kind of well-rounded conversation about the changes on our high street, but specifically since 2021, which is when the Retail Reboot report came out. Have I missed anything, Ed?
No, I think that's a fantastic summary. I was obviously listening in at the time, and it was a really, like you say, well-rounded conversation. So let's roll tape.
Graham, in the report you featured in Retail Reboot, the high street was undergoing a transformation. Could you provide us with an overview of the significant changes that have occurred on the high street since 2021, which is when the report came out?
I can, yeah. It feels like a long time ago. It was obviously back in 21, we were still in the middle of COVID, and there was all kinds of things happening that were unexpected and completely new. But I suppose if you look at where the high street is now, it's probably in a healthier position than you would have expected, despite all the challenges that are out there in terms of cost of living and energy bills and things. And part of the reason for that is that what we've seen is that the online growth that took place during COVID, where we had no option but to shop online in many cases, that has kind of stalled. So online shopping is kind of where it would have been if COVID hadn't happened. So that increase that happened during COVID has peaked and come down a bit. And the high street has, in a sense, come back a bit, because I think post-COVID, people have got back into their old habits. But there's also a bit of a sense that I'm sure we'll explore in more detail around people wanting that connection to the places that they live in.
And Vicky, in the report, we emphasise the need for retailers to adapt, to reinvent themselves. How have retailers responded to these challenges since the release of the report?
I think Graham's right. During COVID, we had this real drive to shop local, and people really wanted to support their local high street. You sort of remember, it's hard, it feels like a long time ago, but you sort of remember those times when the local retailers and farm shops, etc., really kind of stepped in and supported us, and we all wanted to repay the favour. I think that's fallen away a bit, but certainly lots of my retail clients very much shifted to slightly different ways of operating. So, almost using their retail shops as a mini distribution hub for a time. And I think we've retained that a little bit. But people are shifting location slightly. The city is still not what it was in London. The outlet villages, in my experience, are still really buoyant. People want to be there. They're, some of the most successful stores for retailers. But I think the local thing has stayed with us, and we're certainly acting for a lot more, not just the big name clients, but sort of retailers who've got, maybe 4 or 5 outlets, and perhaps are finding a bit of a renaissance there and more support than they were pre-COVID, because to a degree, consumers are probably still shopping a bit more local and wanting that more bespoke sort of independent retail offering.
The report highlighted the impact the pandemic, of course, had on the high street. I mean, it did come out in 2021. Have either of you witnessed any notable legal shifts or regulatory changes that have directly influenced retailers or their operations in the past couple of years?
I mean, I can speak to legal shifts, I suppose. We're certainly seeing, in terms of leases, for example, a lot more flexibility. It's not really a regulatory change as such, but retailers are wanting short leases with early termination right, break clauses, and perhaps also flexibility around, sharing occupation, because lots of different concessions can share one space, and we're certainly, when acting for retailers, being asked to try and build in the option either to terminate quicker or to share occupation, or just be perhaps more creative with the way they're using the space that maybe once upon a time they would have just occupied on their own on a 25-year lease, which seems a long time ago now.
Graham, anything to add on that one about legal shifts or regulatory changes over the last couple of years?
Obviously I'm no lawyer, so I can't comment on the legal things really. But in terms of leases, I think Vicky's absolutely right. Even before COVID, we were seeing leases becoming a lot more flexible, 5 years maybe, rather than the kind of 25 of old, or even more sometimes in the past, and the break clauses and the flexibility. And I think, to be fair to landlords, a lot of landlords, being more kind of agile and more responsive and more flexible in how they do business. I suppose another factor that isn't really legal, but is about regulation and the constraints within which retailers work, is business rates, of course. And we saw from the 1st of April that quite a lot of business rates in many places did come down as part of the revaluation. So I do lots of work in Durham, for example, and we saw that in Durham, quite a lot of business rates on properties have fallen by about a third compared to what they were before the 1st of April. So it still makes business rates a very big barrier to overcome in many cases. But obviously, any reduction is always welcome, and it starts to make it a bit more likely that some retailers and businesses who are currently trading will be able to stay, and that some others who might have considered trading in a location will think, actually, it's starting to become a bit more realistic now.
Well, one of the key focuses of the report was the rise of e-commerce and its impact on traditional brick and mortar stores. How has the balance between offline and online retail evolved since 2021? And what considerations have emerged as retailers navigate this new landscape?
Well, I suppose quite a few of the key themes have already been mentioned, but I suppose what we've seen that's quite interesting is that the pure play e-commerce retailers have often struggled. Some of the ones like Boohoo and ASOS have been struggling a bit and finding that they've got too much warehouse capacity and they're having to deal with the cost of returns and things. And actually, it's the retailers who seem to be straddling bricks and mortar and e-commerce who are the ones who are doing well. And on the topic of returns, we're also seeing that charging is starting to come in for that as well, so that people are starting to realize that a free return isn't really free. It does have a cost in terms of what that cost is on the business. And so that, I think, is a really interesting trend where more and more retailers are starting to pass on at least some of the true cost of returning items onto consumers. And so whether that then has an impact on how people shop, that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because a couple of years back, there was a view that everything was going to go online and the high street would die, and that obviously hasn't played out. But I think that those retailers who are doing both online and offline retail do seem to be succeeding. Certainly, a lot of them. For our clients, some of the sort of shoot-offs of that are dealing with things like turnover rents, for example. I don't think we've mentioned them yet in this podcast, but we've certainly found that turnover rent leases are a lot more common. I mean, they were always common in certain types of retail destination, but a lot more common across the board, so that landlords and tenants in effect share the potential pain and gain of a tenant's trading figures. But one of the challenges that we now find with that is what counts as turnover, because you've got stores where tenants were, originally just selling what was in the store, and now they're maybe doing click and collect orders online, or they're moving stock between stores a lot more frequently than they would have done. So we're really, I think, navigating that change, and landlords and tenants trying to work together to work out what's fair and what should be included in turnover is very much a result of that sort of change in the way that retailers are trading.
Earlier on, Graham, you mentioned one of the changes to the high street is people want to have a far larger connection with the places that they live in. Can you expand a little bit upon that?
Yeah, I think it was partly a COVID thing, as people like me have always been banging on about shop local for ages, and the way in which if you spend £1 locally, it filters through the economy and so on. But I suppose that always felt a bit niche and didn't really cut through until COVID. And then people suddenly kind of, I think, realised what the importance of these local businesses were. And what is really nice is that my sense from being immersed in those kind of places and those kind of messages is that people are still very receptive to that kind of storytelling, that idea that actually if you support a local business, it's supporting a local family, it's all that kind of thing is I think resonating now in a way that it maybe wasn't before, which is really good, because it makes it much easier in a way to encourage people to support and visit independents on their high street, and they understand, I think, the impact of that. And it's partly about people also, I suppose, seeing those retailers who are the big multinationals who maybe aren't seen as paying back all that they should to the countries and locations in which they trade. So that, I think, is a really positive thing, and it seems to be a long-term impact of COVID, which is it's a good thing, really.
You say long-term, but let me just clarify and get you to look into your crystal ball. Do you think? So we did the retail reboot report 2 years ago. Do you think if we jumped on this podcast again in another 2 years' time, that will be a trend that will have remained?
I think so, and it's partly because if you look at high streets in many towns and cities, a lot of the growth is coming from independents anyway, because what happened during COVID is that the low-hanging fruit, if you like, all those big-name retailers who were already teetering on the brink fell over the edge, unfortunately, and there hasn't actually been all that much in the way of other businesses going bust since then. But actually, in terms of the growth, yes, there are some brands still expanding, and that's very welcome. But a lot of the growth is independent. So again, in Durham, to give an example, I reckon about 75-80% of the new businesses opening in Durham are independent. Quite a lot of them are cafes and restaurants and hospitality, but others are things like bookshops. We've had two new bookshops open in Durham in the last year, and those kind of businesses tend to be really good at not just selling stuff, but using the marketing channels really effectively and building a whole community around their brand and around their events and around what they're contributing to the place. So I think that is a really powerful trend, and my sense that it is here to stay.
Vicky, to jump back to you for a question, the report back in 2021 discussed the importance of data protection and privacy in the retail industry. Has there been any significant legal developments or changes in consumer data protection since our previous conversation?
Well, we've obviously got, off the back of Brexit, the new data protection bill and legislation. I mean, I don't think it significantly changes the position, but well, look, we've all seen in the news recently, haven't we? There seems to be a series of big retailers suffering data breaches. We've had JD Sports and Boots and WH Smith. I think T-Mobile were mentioned yesterday. So I suppose it's not so much that the law has changed, but that it will become ever more stringent. And I think, this particularly, you would have thought the big retailers would be getting it right, and clearly are struggling in terms of privacy and protecting the information. But I think going back to those smaller retailers, sometimes we do talk to them and they don't necessarily understand what they're supposed to be doing, what data they're allowed to keep. I don't know, takeaway businesses, for example. So it is something that they need to learn, because obviously the penalties for data breaches and for keeping information you shouldn't are potentially quite large. So not so much a change, but I think it will become, it's newsworthy already, and I think it will remain in the news until we start doing it better, for want of a better way of putting it.
And staying on kind of newsworthy topics, sustainability and environmental concerns have been very prominent in recent years. What legal measures or regulations have emerged to address these issues on the high street, and how have they impacted retailers?
I think, well, from a legal point of view, I mean, this actually goes back to Graham's point as well about, people wanting to shop local. And I think one of the big drivers for that is actually an environmental one, and hopefully, local supply chains and not hundreds of miles of produce going around the country. But we are certainly, in terms of leases, where green leases are very much on the agenda. For some of the larger landlords, years back, if you were a new tenant going in, you would be expected to strip out a unit, completely do a completely new shop fit, new everything. Leases would say you can't use, it has to be new products. You can't use, recycle and reuse shop fit. That has turned on its head. I think there's a lot of talk about it and perhaps not quite so much doing yet. But if you look at, green leases are a subject of a lot of conversations. And if you look at any lease from a institutional landlord now, you've got 5-10 pages of environmental type clauses about measuring utility consumption, working together to reduce energy consumption. Just that the whole lot is being dealt with. But I think it's an ongoing conversation, and it will link in also to the EPC regime, of course, because at the moment you have to have a minimum E rating to let your commercial property, but the intention is that will increase to C and then B, by 2030. So there is an ongoing debate, I suppose, about who should pay for works, what works need to be done, when they will be done to minimise disruption. So that, is very much at the top of the agenda, I would say.
And Graham, to come back to you, the report in 2021 touched upon the challenges faced by local independent retailers, and we discussed them, of course, just a few minutes ago. Has there been any interventions or initiatives aimed at supporting and protecting these businesses since the report?
That's a good question. I suppose a lot of the support for independence tends to be at a local level. So, for example, the work that I do in County Durham is funded via the County Council in Chesterley Street and the Parish Council in Durham, and you tend to get lots of locally targeted business support schemes that are providing training or one-to-one support or whatever it might be. And certainly as a principal, my experience is that if you can provide some kind of local support scheme, it generally is very useful, because I think it's been touched on there by Vicky that sometimes independents don't always have all the information that they need. A lot of them are really savvy, but not all of them. And so if you can provide some kind of support locally, have someone available who can provide advice and mentoring, that I think is really good, because ultimately, if you invest that resource in working with retailers and promoting places, it does genuinely have an impact in making those retailers more likely to succeed and not make big mistakes. But also, if you engage in the place promotion, it certainly helps attract new businesses, and that's the kind of thing that I've been doing lots of in Durham. And we know that by putting out positive messages about the place and about the strength of the independent community there, that does attract new businesses as well.
And our listeners won't be surprised to hear that technology continues to shape the retail sector. Could you shed any light on any challenges or considerations that have arisen due to advancements in areas such as AI, automation, or augmented reality?
I'll be honest, I've spent the last 10 or 15 years going to retail conferences and things where people have been talking about all this kind of stuff. And I can't think of one example where I've been out in the streets in Durham and a retailer said to me, "Oh, Graham, tell me about AI." I think that there's always a bit of a disconnect between what tech is being talked about in the retail press and at conferences and what actually on the ground businesses are doing. So I suppose I'm a bit of a skeptic, to be honest, because I've seen so many examples of the next big thing, and actually the fundamentals of retailing are about being in the right premises in the right place, selling the right stuff to the right people, and doing it in a way that grabs customers and delights them. And I suppose whatever tech you have, it can't be a substitute for the fundamentals of being a great retailer.
Vicky, I'll bring you on this question as well, but just given the context of, we were talking to you about data privacy a second ago, the first thing that of course jumps to my mind is a great kind of recommendation algorithm. So information on a customer saying, well, you bought this from us a few weeks ago. We think you might be interested in this. But coming back to, again, data collection, do you think that there's almost a pullback sometimes from customers when the algorithm is kind of a little bit too good?
I think sometimes people are surprised, aren't they? If you are on Google and it remembers what you looked at, and then it starts trying to sell you the thing when you're looking on Facebook or whatever it might be. And it's I think some consumers are perhaps a bit naive about how much of their information is out there and available and how much is tracked. But there's certainly I guess a group of people who are trying to fight against that. But as it stands, I think the big corporations certainly at the moment know a lot more about us than we probably know and would be happy with if we did realise.
And my final question, looking ahead, what hurdles do you anticipate retailers will face on the high street in the next few years? And what steps can they take to proactively address these challenges? Graham, let's come to you first.
Right. Crikey. Well, I suppose retailers have already been facing quite a lot of challenges. As if you think about it, all these bricks and mortar businesses have successfully navigated COVID for the most part, and now they're having to deal with all the things around the cost of living and energy bills. And I always think it's to their credit that so many businesses have managed to get through all that, and in some cases are still performing really well. So there's a sense almost that if you can get through COVID, you can deal with anything. But I suppose, in a sense, we can't quite know what is on the horizon. If COVID in the last few years has taught us one thing, it's that we can't always predict what the future holds. But I think businesses on the high street have proved how resilient and how agile they are in many cases. But it looks like it's still going to be a tough year or two ahead. I don't think there's a sense that the economy is suddenly going to spring back into life and people are going to have loads of money to spend again. So it comes back to those fundamentals again of just being really good at what you do and making sure that everybody who might be a customer of yours knows what you're offering and is able to come and support you.
Yeah, I think that's right. Those retailers who have been most successful over the last few years, I think, have really shown how flexible and adaptable they can be. And that's not going to change in the short term, is it? With the cost of living crisis and the economy, you sort of I see local businesses on my local high street shifting. So, once upon a time they were just a cafe, and now they're a workspace, and people who work from home, can spend the morning using their Wi-Fi. I think it's about becoming more of a destination than just doing one thing, but very much being adaptable to the circumstances. And the younger generation, because they have quite different ideas, I would say, about spending and what they want to use their money on, and the kind of ethical side of things. And I think those retailers that we'll be talking about 10 years from now will be ones who've embraced that and been willing to change when it hasn't always been easy to do so.
Graham and Vicky, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Legal Thinking, and thank you to our guests for joining us on today's podcast. If you want to find out more about the topic that was discussed today, make sure to have a look in the show notes where we'll have linked everything up.
And you can find all of the back episodes of Legal Thinking in your podcast provider of choice, and you can also subscribe and follow us on there too. And as always, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on a podcast provider of choice, as that helps other people find us. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.